Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the next episode of Authors Bantering. I'm Josh Bresslin, it's Ian M. Rogers, and this week we're going to be going over the difference between working on a short story versus a novel. Ian, you've obviously been doing a ton with both of this lately, so I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, and this is, and I'm glad we're talking about this because this doesn't get talked about often enough. Because a lot of traditional writing classes or writing advice will say give very good advice, which is to start with short stories before writing a novel. The idea that writing short stories can train you or teach you to be a better writer and to prepare you for writing a novel. And in many ways, that is very, very much true. I definitely recommend that writers start with shorter works, stories, learn to develop characters, develop their prose, just get comfortable with style and revision, and develop a lot of those tricks of the trade. But there is a pretty big skills gap there that comes from just working on short stories, and that the only way to learn how to write a novel is to actually write a novel. And so the reason I say that is because novels have a lot of components that short stories do not have. Much longer arcs that need to be developed, more complex character development, setting things up in Act 1 to really pay off in Act 3 is a lot more complex in a novel than it is in a short story. Juggling all sorts of different elements, both for the plot and the characters and theme. And again, this setup element is much more complex in a novel. You have to keep track of a lot more things than you would in an 18 to 23 page short story.
Yep.
And when you first start out, and I'm remembering when I started writing my first novel, you don't know what you don't know. So you think it's the same as a short story, like, okay, I'm using the same skills that I developed in a short story, and you have an idea that it's going to be different or bigger or more complex, but it's hard to imagine exactly how. And so when I'm reading first novels written by writers who might be very good writers, but it's the first time tackling a novel, or working with a client on a first novel, a lot of the stuff that I see is problems with structure and bigger picture structure type stuff that just wouldn't have come up in a shorter story or a shorter essay or a shorter piece. And so it's the idea that if you are looking to write a novel, and you're approaching a lot of these elements for the first time, the best way to do that is just to write the novel, make mistakes, identify those mistakes, and fix those mistakes. You could be the greatest short story writer in the world, but if you've never tried to write a novel at all, you're not going to have a handle on a lot of those bigger picture issues.
Yeah. And a lot of advice, I think a lot of the advice, just to get back to the beginning here, on the short story versus the novel, a lot of it's somewhat dated. So it goes back to also the idea that for agents, like you can, if you do a lot of short stories, it helps you be discovered by agents a lot faster. Nowadays, it's not like that, but way back, that's when the magazines were much bigger, it was a good way to get your name out there. But you're exactly right. The short story in and of itself, the idea that you can learn how to write a first draft, revise, and edit basically a work in potentially do that several times in the course of a year on different projects, you are building up that skill. You could spend a whole year doing just a first draft, never develop any kind of revising skills at all, and go into like year 2 being very facing a lot of challenge. So it does teach you to go through the whole process very, very quickly. It's a bit like building a house, right? If you build 1,000 square foot home, whatever, basically, it's gonna be way easier than building a mansion, right? So if you were to build that first, learn all the ins and outs of that, and how to install things, you'll experience everything a lot faster. It won't take nearly as much time as building that giant mansion. But at the same time, building the mansion is going to be its own sort of challenge. The novel is going to be its own sort of challenge here, and the main difference is that with short stories, you're limited by topic and page count. You can only explore maybe 1 to 2 themes at the most in a short story. And you have a limited word count, 4,500 words, 5,000, whatever it might be, and that's basically it. The novel, you get the freedom to explore more, but it does require a lot more structuring, a lot more outlining. It's immense. It really is. So both are kind of their own sort of beast there, and they're each their own sort of art. I think they have actually more going against them than they do actually being the same, to be honest.
I think in a lot of ways they do too,
Yeah.
in ways that we don't always talk about. The idea that when you have a short story, you have to have a very tight arc. The
Yep.
idea that things have to really, really be building towards this moment of clarity at the end, or this moment of payoff at the end. Or short stories have a lot more consistent, or at least stories published in the last 20 to 30 years have a lot more consistency of form than maybe they did in
Yeah.
earlier generations. The idea that you have to have that hook, and the hook has to take up this much space and be read a certain way, otherwise it doesn't feel like a short story, whatever that means. So those are these separate tricks from a novel, where you could be a great novel writer but not know the short story tricks, and so you wouldn't be able to set those up in the right way to form a really, really
Yep.
tight short story. And I do agree with what you're saying. And again, the idea that the best easiest way for somebody who's just starting out to learn about writing is to write short stories. And I think you can hone different types of skills, and hone those skills faster, and develop more versatile skills, just in terms of things like setting up paragraphs and dialogue and developing characters and just thinking about story writing. I think you can develop those skills faster and better in a short story, versus, say, if the first thing you ever wrote was a novel draft, you could very easily get in over your head and not know how to make a lot of those things work on the page.
It's a big confidence booster too. Like to be able
Yep.
to like say you go through a whole year of doing short stories, you might be able to maybe write like 5 short stories in a year, in just 1 year here. Spending I don't know 2 months or so on each one. Which yeah, if you're newer, that's they may not be the greatest, but I guarantee you your fifth short story is gonna be better than your first one. At the same time, a novel takes so long that your skill might develop, but you won't notice it. Like you could spend 1 to 2 years basically just on one story here, and not really notice your skill develop at all. And all of a sudden, maybe you work on your next story after that, and you go, "Wow, this first draft's way better than my first draft." And then you finally see it, but you don't. But this sets up the long gap of you feeling like you're not making progress. You don't realize how good you're getting, just because you're stuck on that same sort of long project. Whereas you go into new projects every couple months, that you're going to see the progress. You're going to see a lot more progress and a lot more of your skill development a lot quicker.
Yes. Yeah, I think when you're first starting out, it can be really easy to get discouraged and
Yep.
to give up. And I think doing something like finishing a short story, like actually like, writing the end, brushing it off, revising it, seeing how good it looks after it's revised, even if it's not perfect, which again, it won't be if you're just starting out, but it will give you some confidence. It'll say, yes, I did this. I finished this story and I can show it to my friends. And I think that is just tremendous for your confidence level, in a way that spending 6 to 9 months working on a novel draft is not going to be, because that's way too long to go without a win.
Absolutely. And the other thing too was that, like kind of like we were saying before, and it's a moment ago here. It's the idea of getting feedback too. Like it's a lot harder to get feedback on a single chapter and make progress than it is to read a whole short story and get a lot of feedback, right? Because it's one of those things. Someone sees one chapter, that could be true, but there may be things that happen later in your novel that kind of make up for that or explain some of the objections and all that stuff. I'm very famous when I first started for being like, in the next chapter that gets explained. With a short story, everyone sees it, so you're getting the whole thing gets critiqued. You can get feedback on the entire piece. It's way better. It's way better than just getting partial feedback on on individual chapters as you go along and trying to make this whole thing work.
I would even go so far as to say that in many critique circles, not all, but in many critique circles, looking at individual chapters of a novel can often not be very helpful, because the reader doesn't have an idea of how it fits into the bigger whole. And they
Exactly.
might make erroneous assumptions, or think the story's going in a different way, or maybe not see something, or they're going to comment on something that's wrong, but they're going to miss why it's wrong because they don't see what comes later.
Bingo.
And the idea that it's hard to, as a beginning critiquer, it's hard to look at an entire novel and give structured feedback on it. I think that can be very, very difficult. So breaking things down into chapters is a natural way to develop those skills. But in a lot of ways, critiquing chapters individually is going to be less perfect and have more flaws and difficulties to it, as opposed to reading a short story where what you see is what you get, and you can talk about it in the session or give feedback in an email or whatever.
Yeah, and just I guess kind of a final thing that we're on the subject for a minute. Longer works also, especially for critique, lend themselves to being overly critiqued unnecessarily. Like, it's one of those things where you can write a really good chapter, like 1 or 2 chapters, you said to a critique group, they'll critique it, they'll find things that are wrong with it, just to have something to offer feedback on, even if it's not something that really that's a big deal. They might just say, oh, this didn't work for me, I didn't like this, and you could end up changing entire sections of chapters that actually are fine, that work really well, but the person couldn't really find anything large to talk about in outside of just saying, not wanting to be like, I can't find anything wrong with this. They'll find little things here and there, nitpick, and offer a lot of more personal, like, I just don't happen to find this to work for me, rather than sort of structural feedback that'll be more along the lines of what you're looking for, which is, I know what you're trying to do with a piece, it's just not working. So short stories, again, lend themselves to avoid a lot of that unnecessary critique as well, which we'll get into another video at some point about critique groups. But to wrap it up, though, I was going to say, wrap it up.
I was going to say, definitely be wary of the person who says something for the sake of saying something, because they feel they need to have to make a point. And again, that's very rarely are those going to be the best bits of critique that you get in a session.
Absolutely. Well, maybe next week. Maybe we'll do it next week. But with that, I guess to wrap it up here, Ian, give me, I guess, like a couple, like 1 or 2 things that a short story has that a novel doesn't have that can help you as a writer, and vice versa. So like 1 of the 2 advantages of working on those that we haven't hit yet.
I would say the biggest skills you can develop from working on short stories is beginnings and endings.
Okay.
So learning how to write hook, attention grabbing beginnings, and learning how to write moment of clarity, big payoff endings. I think you can develop those skills very quickly in a short story. In some ways, they're going to be short story specific, but a lot of ways they will transfer to a novel as well.
Perfect.
And then for working on a novel, your biggest specific skills are going to be learning to set things up at the beginning of the book to pay off later. This is very, very difficult, but you can only learn how to do it in a novel. And then I would say working with more complex character backstories.
Yep.
Not every novel is going to have these, but learning how to add information in at appropriate times is going to be much more challenging in a novel. But if you can learn to do it, it's going to be much more natural.
Perfect.
When you're perfecting that.
Like that. I think for me, just to kind of wrap it up, I think with a short story, you learn what it teaches you the best, I think for at least me, is to be economical with your writing, to actually be able to hit a certain word count, which makes you being very selective about your sentences and what you show and how much detail you decide to go into. If you have, like, say, a 4,500 word count for a short story, you're going to be a lot more selective about the detail of your characters, how you describe them, and how much backstory you decide to even offer them, and what you tend to show. It makes you very, very selective about what really needs to be necessary, which is excellent for working on novels at a certain point with novels as well. And I think with novels, the big thing with them that you take away is the ability to obviously structure your stories that are very large, just to have an actual good outline, to actually structure plot points, but more so being able to balance multiple themes in the story. That is huge, right? When we write novels, there's always certain things we want to explore, certain areas that we want to show, and that's such a hassle to have to juggle it. That's such a challenge. And I think for me, working on novels, the big thing I learned very early on was the idea of being able to showcase and spotlight a couple different core ideas and actually give them enough time on the page for each one to be explored without, you getting a scenario where you just touch upon little things here and there, but never really go deep enough to explore some of the questions that you've prompted at the start of the story. And so,
well said.
Yeah. And so with that, if you're kind of working on your first novel, or you're working on your first short story, or kind of stuck in between here, we hope this has been helpful. With that, if you have enjoyed it, please make sure to give it a like, make sure to subscribe. And with that, we'll be back next week. New videos come out on Mondays. And so we will see you next Monday. I'm Josh Bresslin. That's Ian M. Rogers. And we will see you next week.
Take it easy.